we should be good to go.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Shenandoah County Heritage Day, which is brought to you by the Shenandoah County Historical Society and the Shenandoah County Library's Truban Archives. And we thank you for taking the time to join us today on either Zoom or Facebook Live. In case you're new to this particular presentation and haven't had this request before, if you're from somewhere other than Shenandoah County in the Valley, we'd love it if you put where you live in the chat room. We're just interested to know where folks are from who are attending today. And before I introduce our speaker for the next program, which is Woodstock Reservoirs, a brief history of water in Woodstock, our county archivist, Zach Hoddle, has a few management notes that he needs to share with you.
All right, so hello, everyone. Welcome again to Heritage Day 2021. I will be on board today for technical support. So if there are any issues, I will hopefully be there to correct them. Let me know in the chat if you experience any difficulties and we will work to address those. A couple housekeeping notes. Number one, everyone is on mute and we will leave you on mute during the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please add those in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you are joining us on social media, you can leave those in the comments section. I'll be monitoring those. And what will happen is the questions from the chat and from social media will be relayed at the end. I will ask our presenter the questions and she will do her best to answer all of those. The session does end at around 2:50, and we will have a brief wrap up and then we will actually be finished for today. So thanks again for joining, and I will turn it back over to Barbara.
Thanks, Zach. Our next program, and it is our final presentation of the day, is Woodstock Reservoirs, a brief history of water in Woodstock. And I think it's a topic that not many of us know a lot about. And I was thinking that the creation of Seven Bend State Park at Woodstock might have sparked some of this because it's right on the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. And of course, that's who Mariama works for. Mariama Dryak is the program coordinator for the Friends of the North Fork. She came to Shenandoah County in the Friends group in September of 2020, which is an interesting time to be making a big change in your life. She is an earth scientist, and her interest in the environment began during her growing up years on a small family farm in Wisconsin. She studied physical geography at Durham University in the UK and received her master's degree in 2019 from the University of Maine in Earth and Climate Science. She's packed a lot into her young life so far and has worked in the outdoor and environmental science fields from Alaska to New Mexico to Panama to the banks of the Mississippi River. And she's now working with and listening to the North Fork watershed community, developing educational programming and active engagement in science in our community. Mariama, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Barbara. I'm going to just share my screen before I launch into it. So here we are to discuss Woodstock Reservoirs and history of water in Woodstock. And before we get into the water aspect of things, for those of you who don't know, Friends of the North Fork is a nonprofit based in Woodstock, focused around keeping the North Fork clean, healthy, and beautiful through community action, education, science, and advocacy. So if you haven't heard of us, I recommend checking out our website. We have a lot of wonderful educational, volunteering, and science programs in the works. And we really thrive off of community participation in advocating for the river health. And ultimately, that is all connected to us, because we are really reliant on water. Beans composed of approximately 70% water. And what we'll learn about today is that if you live in the town of Woodstock, we are intrinsically connected to the river and reliant on it for water resources. And in general, that means that it's a good idea to take care of it. So before I launch into the presentation side of things, I want to give a huge thank you to Zach Hoddle, who helped me sift through a whole bunch of county archives to put together the presentation, which was certainly sparked out of wanting to educate in Seven Bends State Park around the history of the reservoirs and water in the valley more broadly, but specifically as it relates to the history of the Woodstock Reservoirs. So thank you, Zach, for pulling out newspaper articles and books and things for me to pour over. So that's what this presentation will be based upon. And I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have at the end. Okay, so before we launch into water specific to Woodstock, though, I think it's important to have a really brief background on where we get our drinking water from. So many of us may know this, but I think it's worth saying that there are two main places you can get drinking water from. There are surface water resources and groundwater sources. So surface water in Virginia is intuitively the water that we can see. So that might come from rivers, lakes, springs, and wetlands. And if you're interested, here's a breakdown of the different quantities of water in those different features within Virginia. And then we also might get groundwater from water stored beneath the soil mantle. And often wells, if you're reliant on water coming from wells, are tapped into large masses of water, groundwater resources called aquifers. And I think it's worth saying that we're in a privileged place here with the amount of groundwater resources we have available, but places like the Southwest US are struggling to, or the pace of groundwater recharge, so the rate at which those resources are replenished, is struggling to keep up with the population growth and population capacity in that region. And so here I've included precipitation and recharge ranges from 8 inches to 10 inches in Virginia, which is a good thing to know in general, given that approximately, well, as of 1994, approximately 34% of Virginians were reliant on wells for drinking water. So for those of you reliant on wells, that's a little plug for where you get your water from, but we're going to be focusing specifically on the history of surface water extraction for Woodstock here. Before we dive into that specifically, though, we're going to, I think, a good background for why the Woodstock reservoirs were created in the first place is because of water pollution and the fact that we didn't have clean water resources in this area at the time. And so I'm going to go through the main pollutants of water. So sediments are a huge source of pollution, which might not be super intuitive, but it's really important to focus on sediment reduction in like trying to prevent it from entering our water resources, because that can affect water quality. And the Shenandoah River, interestingly, has a lot of sediment pollution due to the agricultural practices in the region. And there are ways we can mitigate that. There are lots of incredible government agencies and non-governmental agencies focused around educating around how to reduce that through best management practices like cover crops and such. But I think an interesting anecdotal explanation of why this is super relevant to us is I went to Harper's Ferry in the fall, and there you see the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah River. And there was this striking, very visual example of how sediment laden the Shenandoah was in comparison to the Potomac as they were converging. You could see that through like really cloudy kind of brownish waters converging with cleaner waters, cleaner in the sense of less sediment waters coming from the Potomac. And you can actually see that on Google Earth. I just checked it out before the presentation. So if you're interested, definitely take a look. Water can also be polluted from storm water runoff in urban and suburban flows, and that carries all these sorts of things that pollute impermeable surfaces like car oil and other things spilled on the surface. We also have phosphates and nitrates that can enter water resources through agricultural routes. Also, improperly treated sewage or limited capacity for storing sewage can lead to issues when you have storms or if septic systems fail. And we'll come back to these these two I just presented soon. Industrial wastes are also super relevant if industry isn't doing their due diligence to clean the waters they're putting back into water resources. We also have acids and leachates from mines and dumps, encroaching saltwater, especially relevant to coastal areas. And this can actually pollute aquifers that people rely on for wells or through wells. I was just talking to someone 2 days ago whose parents were building a new place, and they had drilled their well just a little bit too far, a couple centimeters too far, and they hit salt water, which then intruded on their whole aquifer and ruined that freshwater resource, because at current, we're not adapted to drink salt water. And then herbicides and pesticides, also super relevant to agricultural practices, but also people treating their lawns. And this can happen through stormwater runoff or runoff in general. Okay, so these two are super relevant to where we're going to go, and we're going on a journey back through time to the year 1900. In 1900, prior to 1978, the pigs were allowed to roam the streets. They were not required to be penned. And in general, livestock waste caused a lot of stench and pollution issues in town. And it's really interesting that if you read back through newspaper articles, which is where I got a lot of my information, or some books that have combined a whole bunch of secondary resources from the time, you hear a lot of citizens around the 70s or 1870s and 1880s talking about how this was a big issue, and that caused a lot of stench issues, along with stench issues and limited capacity associated with outhouses, because up until 1901, Woodstock residences did not have plumbing or septic systems. Everything, if you had to go to the bathroom, had to be done through outhouses. And prior to 1901, Woodstock's water came from wells, and as I say, these were polluted by animal and human waste. So residents pulled their water from cisterns or wells. There were about 8 public wells owned by the town of Woodstock in use throughout the town up to 1900. And in general, what was reported were poor conditions, and the wells being in poor conditions. So them being polluted by dead animals, or polluted from runoff due to issues with outhouses not being properly maintained. And so often many of these public wells weren't really usable in terms of clean water. And I actually have a list here. I'm not going to go into it for the sake of time right now, but it's really cool to look back through the records, specifically looking at Clower's book from 1996. And he lists out where all of these wells were. So there were some on North Main Street, Muhlenberg, East Court Street, etc. So if you're interested in figuring out, maybe where you live in relation to where old wells were, definitely take a look at that resource. So in 1897, citizens started, raising concern about water pollution in municipal wells. And you can see this through articles written into the Shenandoah Herald, really saying things aren't great here. Things are quite polluted. Here's a direct quote from the Herald, the Shenandoah Herald, saying, there are bad stenches associated with swill barrels, hog pens, closets, and cow yards, and that not being adequately taken care of. And this spurred the mayor in 1899 to authorize to be authorized by the town council to call a town meeting for citizens to discuss what they might do in terms of getting running water in the town. And in the spring, so this was a kind of back and forth semi-controversial topic, which I'll go into a little bit of in the next slide. But ultimately in the spring of 1900, the council decided to construct a reservoir on Massanutten Mountain on the east side of town. Before we move on, I think it was really interesting to read people's perspectives writing into the Shenandoah Herald, because there were some kind of humorous quips put in there, like some people encouraging people on the town council because they didn't think that they were acting fast enough to take a walk on these specific streets that they list out, past perhaps some wells or outhouses on a really hot day, and which meant that the stench was terrible, and they could see the results of not having running water, and then come back to this person who wrote into the paper and tell them that they didn't need running water, because it sounded like these people thought that the council were kind of isolated or insulated from having to put up with that sort of stench. So it was quite humorous. If you ever have some time, I recommend looking through some of these articles. And so these are some bits I pulled from the Shenandoah Herald, and I think show some of the humor, or kind of like tongue-in-cheek pokes at saying the people against this really should reconsider, because ultimately we need water. For example, one of these articles in the center here says, basically suggests that those who are against the waterworks should have a great opportunity of carrying colder water for a longer distance through the snow this winter, and continue to do that manually, while their job could be made much more easy through having running water installed. Here's another in the bottom center, kind of funny little very small article that starts out with saying it's so costly, but essentially says everyone who wants to use these things can certainly afford it. There were other articles on the left to center, that go super analytically into the breakdown of what a cost would be associated with installing the water system, and what that would mean to rising taxes, and really make a solid case in terms of numbers for installing waterworks. And then there were some other kind of humorous articles that you can see here bookmarking the other articles I included, that lay out different pros and cons of water systems, and different perspectives associated with people who thought it was too expensive to install waterworks, and others who said, oh, this will be really great for health. And then ultimately it goes into they were relaying all of this that was apparently in a dream of theirs, and they talk about beautiful women in the same article and how their dream woman was in their dream, and they're also talking about water. So it's kind of a humorous, some of the articles are pretty humorous if you have a chance to take a look. Okay, so those in favor, generally what I extracted from all of those articles were that those in favor thought that it would be really beneficial to health and prevention of typhoid fever. And that was especially supported by medical doctors at the time, because in the 1900s, which I'll circle back to at the very end, typhoid fever was really dramatically affecting many populations. There was another newspaper article that mentioned that while typhoid fever hadn't affected Woodstock heavily so far, Woodstock was super lucky because they didn't have this running water resource at the time. And yet, like, all of these towns and communities were really suffering from typhoid fever issues associated with lack of running water. So it was kind of like they were saying, well, certainly we haven't been affected too badly so far, but we should probably put some great mechanisms in place, i.e. running water, to prevent that, because there's only so long that our luck can hold out. They also thought it beneficial to fire prevention, quality of living for future generations. And those against it were generally against it, from what I could tell, even though there were fewer articles written from the perspective of those against it, were against it because of associated rises in taxes and the cost associated with the construction of the dam. But ultimately, in 1900, a vote was taken on whether or not to authorize a bond issue for $20,000 for installing the waterworks in Woodstock. And the vote was 176 in favor and 48 opposed. On the left, I've included a little bit of the announcement in the Shenandoah Herald from the issue on November 16th, 1900, announcing enthusiastically that they had approved installation of water system. And they include flowery language saying, we're going to have the best water system in the nation. And ultimately, the bid for the water system construction went to G.L. McCain at $18,200 for the installation. There are other names associated with other bids that, if you're interested in, you could take a look through the materials to secure. But they started constructing these reservoirs at that time. Oh, okay. Before we get onto that, though, these are some enthusiastic reports associated with the construction of the reservoirs. And these reservoirs were constructed on Massanutten Mountain, east of town, and are currently located in Seven Bend State Park, as we alluded to at the start of the presentation. So these articles have a lot of enthusiastic information about the construction process and enthusiastically delivered information about the construction process. And I've distilled it down, some of the information in these two articles down to these main takeaways, which I'll walk you through. So the reservoirs were built 1,100 feet above the North Fork, and it's fed by what was called an unobtrusive stream high on the mountain that feeds the North Fork. And there was some speculation at where this water came from. It probably came from a spring a little bit higher up on Massanutten Mountain, but another article suggests that the water was sourced from mist kissing the mountain each day, which was really beautiful imagery, but kind of amusing information to consume, knowing that it certainly had to have come from a spring. And the water was first turned on for testing on June 29th, 1901, to see how the reservoir construction was holding up. But I'll share with you later that it wasn't until November until the mains could be tapped. So the water coming from this project, though, was really high quality. People were really ecstatic with the quality they were getting from this high up mountain water. At the time, they thought that it couldn't be polluted because it was so high up on the mountain. Over time, they did experience, animals kind of stumbling into the reservoirs and polluting it a little bit, but it was a much better situation than pulling water from the wells as they had previously. So the reservoir, first constructed in 1901, was 100 square feet, is 100 square feet. You can still see it today. It's very, very cool to see, and recommend taking a walk in Seven Bend State Park. And I'll show you some imagery a little bit later to hopefully, pique your interest for doing so. And it's located in a gorge of conglomerate rock. So the walls of the dam were constructed of rock and cement, and originally the bottom of the reservoir was made of clay. And the justification for using clay was that they thought it to be much more watertight than any other sort of material. But what they found, and what is relayed in this article on the far right, is that there was a 20,000 gallon leakage per day associated with using clay as that bottom. And so it was replaced with grout and cement instead. And then all of that water, so those water systems on Massanutten were gravity fed. So their pressure came from that drop in elevation. And it was transported to Woodstock via iron pipes from the reservoir. And when the water crossed the river, it did so through steel pipes. And the total run of all of this transport was approximately 2.4 miles to where the center of distribution was in town. So as I said, the water systems were gravity fed, and the engineer completed the dam on the east side of town on Massanutten Mountain on October 19th, 1901. Excuse me if I said earlier, November. And I think the reason I included this article here is to give a context for how big of a feat this was to construct at the time, because I just happened upon this when I was looking through the newspapers for anything related to water. This little quip here that I will read, end quote. An automobile carrying 2 gentlemen passed through Woodstock last Monday. It was the first one that has passed over the Valley Turnpike. In a few years, they will probably be as common as bicycles are now. And I thought this interesting to include because clearly they were constructing this with limited technology, and it was a very physical and manual process, and yet they still completed it in about 2.5 years time. And I think that's quite impressive, especially how far up it was on the mountain and the materials they had to carry there. So on October 19th, 1901, after it was completed, Thomas and company were contracted and notified that they could tap the mains for users. And ultimately it took 2.5 years to complete this whole thing. I'm going to take you on a little journey to Seven Bend State Park and show you a 360 imagery experience so that you can see what the reservoirs look like in the park. But before we do that, I'll give you a little bit of context. So that first reservoir was built 1900, finished 1901. And what they found is that there wasn't enough water storage. The pressure was good, but there wasn't enough water storage for what the demands on water were at the time. And so in 1911, they built a second reservoir 60 feet below the first, and we're now going to take a look at that. Oh, okay. It just stopped sharing. One moment. Okay, so here we are at the first reservoir, the reservoir that was completed in 1901. I put together this imagery for a project I'm trying to do related to virtual education for kids in the Shenandoah Valley, but I thought it was a great opportunity to use it now. This is what the completed 100 square foot reservoir looks like. Looked like in the fall. It has a lot of, leafy greens and such in it at that time. It looks a little bit different today. To get here, you can get here starting on the Hollingsworth side of the park and hiking approximately 2.5 miles up the Pawpaw Hollow and then the reservoir trails. It's a really beautiful hike, highly recommend. And this is, as I said, the upper dam, or reservoir rather. And so to get here, you have to pass that second reservoir that was constructed in 1910, 1911. And this is what that second reservoir looks like. It's empty, whereas that first one still has water in it, still is being fed. And I didn't go closer to this, so you can definitely, in the park, there's a trail that runs right along it, and you can explore it a little bit if you'd like, but this is probably the best image I have of it here. And I thought it was worth showing you because they are really, really incredible construction feats, I think, to have happened at the time. Okay. Here's just an added justification to check out the reservoir trail because I took this photo in the fall and it has a beautiful view. This is just beyond the reservoirs. It has a beautiful view of the North Fork if you're interested too. Okay, so water demands continue to increase in Woodstock as populations rise into the mid-1950s. And before, though, that was so much that they decided they needed more water capacity. There was a sewer system installed on Mill Road with water pulled from Stony Creek Reservoir.
Hey, Mariama,
Uh-huh.
we've actually lost the picture
Oh no.
I have on my end.
Okay, here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll go back one bit then. This is the really cool photo that I wanted to show you all on the reservoir trail. Can you see it now, Zach?
Yes, it's back.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so water demands increase and a sewer system was installed with more water pulled from the reservoir on Stony Creek near North Mountain, and this is west of town. I think before I tell you a little bit more about a construction of a secondary reservoir dam, what's interesting is that the Woodstock 250th anniversary book, written in 2002, conveyed that mortality rate in Woodstock was deemed to be lower than any other point in the US, according to research from a medical doctor in Richmond. And he noted excellent water supply from the mountains and really great health of citizens. And I found that really interesting, given that they were still getting their water from those reservoirs. And there was continued pride in the waterworks, even as demands on water was increasing. With those demands increasing, they just needed to build more infrastructure. So that's where in 1957 and 1958, between those 2 years, the West End Reservoir Dam was built on Little Stony Creek. And this acted as a water source for Woodstock until 1979, when again, there was an increased need for water. So, if for context of where this dam is, if you are not aware, Little Stony Creek is a tributary of the North Fork of the Shenandoah. And this dam is located approximately 1.9 miles along it. Currently, it is no longer used. As it says here, it was phased out in 1979. But it is still used and retained, the water is retained for use in the case of emergency. So we still can tap into that if need be for Woodstock. And it impounds a significant amount of water, 18 million gallons. I think noting that this is still a useful resource for Woodstock, I think it's also really interesting to think about the pipes, as I explained, that transported water from those reservoirs on Massanutten Mountain to cross the river and to town. Those pipes are actually still used too. Really interestingly, those iron and steel pipes used formerly, for reservoir transport to town, they're now used to take water sourced now from the North Fork, which I will shortly be telling you about, back to citizens who live on the other side of the river near Massanutten Mountain. So that infrastructure is still useful today. So with improved technology, increasing population, we were able to increase capacity for water and water extraction. And what they did is in 1978, there was a water treatment plant built on the North Fork, Broadview Lane, and you can see it here. I pulled a Google image to show you also that it is very closely located to the North Fork. That's because they pull water from the North Fork now. All of the municipal water comes from the North Fork, is treated, and at that time, they were able to pump and treat on average 750,000 gallons of water per day. And that system was updated in 1999. And the treatment changed to be liquid coagulant chemical feeding. And they're able to treat more water more efficiently, decrease sludge volume, and essentially the capacity increased so much that they were able to withdraw 1.8 million gallons from the river daily. And in that documentation that relayed those numbers to me, they said that, well, that wasn't used at the time. That was the possibility of how much could be extracted. And they were trying to account for growth to that end as well. So this is water treatment. And many of you may know that there is also a wastewater treatment plant in Woodstock. So with improved technology, we were able to improve, how we were dealing with sewage as well. So in 1987 and 88, the wastewater treatment plant on Mill Road was built, and you can see where it's located here. Also a Google Maps image, and you can also see on the right is the North Fork of the Shenandoah, also located right by the river. And at that time, it was able to treat 500,000 gallons per day. Now, there may be some gaps in the timeline here, because this 2010 update is something I learned by directly speaking with someone at the wastewater treatment plant. And so if anyone else knows information in between those dates, definitely please feel free to share with us at the end. But in 2010, what I do know is that the wastewater treatment plant was updated. So it had increased capacity for treatment, and the type of treatment changed. So prior to the upgrade, the way that they were dealing with sewage is that they had an extended aeration treatment of activated sludge. These are all jargon related to the wastewater treatment industry that I had to Google some of the information around. So definitely feel free to do that too if you need more context. But now they use what are called membrane bioreactors. And that's what was relayed to me as being the heartbeat of the system now. And that is related to or called overall an enhanced nutrient removal system. So it's updated technology that was able to do a better job at treating the wastewater and also increase how much could be treated. So it can treat up to 2 million gallons per day, which is pretty significant. And so in general, I think a good summary of these most recent updates are that the water for Woodstock is taken from the river, treated, consumed, and then the wastewater from municipal activities is treated at this Woodstock wastewater plant and then returned to the river. I included here a diagram taken from the town of Woodstock's website that kind of explains the process and is a little confusing to me, but I think there are a couple main takeaways we could pull from it. So we have water coming in, deoxygenation tanks, and then this bioreaction situation that was explained to me. Those solid wastes are extracted, and then that water, I think a missing arrow is that the water is returned to the river. I wanted to put all of this in the context of Virginia as a state and then also the nation. So as far as I can understand, Virginia really was at the forefront of not only legislation related to, clean water, but also, or clean water standards, but also laid the foundation for safe drinking water practices. This is a quote taken from the Virginia Department of Health. And they included some dates there that are super relevant. So the first sanitation law in Virginia was established in Jamestown in 1610. And it was the first attempt, as far as I could understand nationally, but it's especially in this state, for attempting at maintaining a clean water supply. And I wanted to bring it back to the fact that it was really cool that Woodstock was very much on it in terms of installing a water system, given that in 1900 typhoid fever was a really big deal and was killing 36 out of every 100,000 people. And also included on that Department of Health website, they noted that chlorine was used by New Jersey just after 1900 to disinfect things and reduce, numbers of deaths related to typhoid fever, and ultimately treat water to make it safe for consumption. So that's all I have for today. I wanted to end on a note that, as you can see in the images on the right, there was a lot of pride associated with the reservoir and waterworks systems, and they were included on postcards from the area, in the 1900s. And I think that's a pretty cool, positive note to end on. And I would love to do my best to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please drop those in the chat, or if you're listening on social media, leave us a comment and we will try to get those answered for you. All right, I am not seeing any questions from anyone. If you do, contact information is available on your screen there, and I'm also going to drop that into the chat so everyone can see it.
Great. And also, I think a wonderful thing is that I've been learning from a lot of people, certainly a lot of resources, but a lot of people in the community too. And so if you have added pieces to the story of water in Woodstock or water in the Valley, I would love to hear from you as I'm putting together information board material for the park and also for some programming. So please feel free to reach out at the email here and to check out our website and learn what Friends is about.
And we're getting several thank yous. Oh, there is a question. Actually, we have two questions now. Let me get to the first one here. Was what year was the reservoir constructed?
Which reservoir?
It just says the reservoir, so maybe I guess the original one.
1900, and it was when the first reservoir was begun being built, and it was finished in 1901. And then it was 1910, 1911, where the second reservoir that increased storage capacity for water, that's that lower reservoir I showed you in Seven Bend State Park currently. That's when that was built. And then in the late 1950s, so 1957, 1958 is when the Little Stony Creek Reservoir Dam was built.
Okay. And then there's a question if there were plans to refill the second reservoir, the one on the park.
Not that I'm aware of. I think I know that currently, as a part of Seven Bend State Park, they're being preserved for historic purposes. And actually, the North Fork Conservation Corps program with Friends of the North Fork, composed of high schoolers, did a great job at kind of beautifying and making more accessible the reservoirs to visit for hikers and such. But that's the primary use right now of those old reservoirs on that.
Okay. Then we have one that says on the reservoir trail that there are several small reservoirs, and they wanted to know if you know what those were used for.
I've been so intrigued by them, and I've really enjoyed visiting them, but I really don't know. My only thought was increased storage capacity, but they're very small. And so I really don't know what their purpose is. And I didn't see anything in the literature about what their purpose was.
All right. And then we have one that says, wants to know if the Burnshire Dam is part of the town water system.
It is not. So Burnshire Dam is used for electricity generation and hydropower. but it's not related to drinking water at all. And it's a really interesting run of river dam that is very useful for hydroelectric, but not for drinking water.
All
And
right.
Lee Harvey, current owner of Burnshire Dam, could tell you more about it if you're interested. He's really nice and has a lot of great information about the history of Burnshire Dam.
Okay. We also have a question about if there's any information available about the other towns' water systems.
So I certainly know that it exists, but I have not done a deep dive into that. I was actually just talking to a gentleman this morning who said he's visited like 5 of the early reservoirs throughout the valley. So I know Edinburgh has one that he visited, Edinburgh, Strasbourg, Newmarket. But as far as literature and information specifically recorded in newspapers about it, I don't know.
Okay. And I will add that there is information available about the other reservoirs at the archives here. So if anyone wants to learn more, we would be we'd be happy to help you out with that. Let's see. Then, so we had a clarification about the question of the reservoir construction. That they were asking about the first reservoir constructed at the Stony Creek.
1926.
Yes. What was that again?
So that was using water for sanitation purposes. Let me look back at my notes. I was a little bit confused by the inclusion of 1926 as well. And I didn't get great clarification from reading through my notes and images I had taken of the resources I was consulting. But what I do know is that a sewer system was installed on Mill Road. And there was additional water pulled from Stony Creek in 1926 for use in maintaining the sewer system. But from what I read, the installation of the West End Reservoir Dam on Little Stony Creek was built in 1957-58.
All right.
I hope that clarifies some.
Thank you. I hope it does. Hope it does too for Phyllis, who I think was the one to ask that question. All right. All right. I don't see any other questions. Thank you for everyone that did ask them. I think those were some great questions. And I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Barbara for our wrap up, if she is ready.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you very much, Mariama. I will add one thing, that at the historic courthouse visitor center and museum, which we operate, we have a small photo montage of the courthouse in Court Square. And one of the photographs is from, I wish I remembered the year, whenever the waterworks were finished and were brought online. It's a photograph that I know the library has somewhere, of this huge crowd in front of in Court Square with bunting and people dressed up, and they were celebrating the waterworks and having water, I guess, come out of their taps, or almost. It's a fun photograph to see. So thank you very, very much for this presentation. I have a feeling that you might have offers from other people to come and do some history on their own water works at the different towns, now that you've done this one so well. And I would just thank all of our presenters today. We've had what a variety of topics, and all that refer to different aspects of history of our county. It's really been great. And I thank you from the Historical Society and from the library archives. And again, I just want to also leave you with 2022 is going to be Shenandoah County's 250th anniversary. So Heritage Day in April 2022 will be special. And we hope you will tune in to social media, to our website, schs1795.com, Facebook at SCHSVA, the library's website, and the 250 committee is hard at work with the help of one of your presenters today, Hank Zimmerman, to create a website just for the 250th. So thank you all very much for a different but very interesting Heritage Day 2021.